We are also joined by award-winning writer and journalist Paula Erizanu, who has recently been proposed for the EU Prize for Literature with her latest book, Aici și Raiul și Iadul, Here's Both Heaven and Hell, which I would also like us to refer to. We have 3 undergraduate students joining our roundtable. Cristina Bradescu, hi Cristina, from SIS, Sociology and Politics, born in the Republic of Moldova. Maria Popa from SIS, who's studying comparative literature and Romanian. And Kati Rotaru, who is studying physics at Loughborough University, but who is a dedicated fan of Tatiana's writing and was also born in Moldova. Cristina and Kati are also childhood friends. Thank you all for participating. Tatiana and Paula, thank you for presenting here tonight. We have lots of questions for you. And I will open the conversation by asking Tatiana a question. All your characters are rather troubled, unhappy people, often migrants. What made you choose to create them and write about them? Or what inspired you?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. It's actually very refreshing to be amongst young people. So for once, I can speak about trauma and identity with much younger people, and I hope it's going to be a dialogue as well, not only a monologue, because it's quite boring after a certain age to talk about problems only. Why my characters are so unhappy and troubled? I don't think they are. I think they're just the result of the story we're telling, especially my last character from my last novel. I know that some people think it's very raw and it's cruel and it's indeed a troubled woman. But I was thinking that I can't make this woman, Mila, different, because she is one of the first migrants leaving Moldova. And I think it's important to say that migration, which I described in this book, is not at all migration we know today, because people who leave the country today, they are people who speak languages, they have documents, they have at least one person who is able to say, come, drop by, stay here, I'll feed you, I'll give you a bed. And the first wave of migrants were in completely different situations. First of all, people had to borrow money to leave the country, and of course they had to leave the country illegally, and that was in itself an act of courage, because many of them became a victim of human trafficking. Many of them ended up working as prostitutes or being enslaved for years. Some of them never were able to integrate in the new countries, and they lived in horrible places. So I think it's very important to talk about that first wave of migration, because we forgot, meanwhile, because most of us, even my generation already, let aside your generation, we went there because we could. And because we just wanted to live better and we thought it's our right. While Mila, just going back to the character and to your question, she cannot be politically correct in the book. She cannot have this, optimistic vision, even because she is over 50. She is in a country where she never explored her potential, because she was a teacher in Moldova and she became a cleaning lady in Paris, where she lives. She doesn't particularly want to stay in France, but no one particularly waits for her to go back in Moldova. So I don't have anything to say in my defense as a writer by creating these very cruel characters, but I do have something to say in her defense, because I thought that that voice cannot be different, and you will be the judge of how skillful that was done. But I'm very happy how she turned out. Because even in that very gloomy way, she still keeps a hint of humanity, and she still feels that she found her happiness in a way or another. Those of you who already read the book, you know that there is this very funny title in a way, which is, it's when you are happy, strike first. And of course it's a weird title because you don't strike when you're happy, but in the same time, this is the feeling of most of the time of Eastern Europeans that, you know, when you are happy, something bad will happen, at least in that generation. And this fear of being totally happy, perfectly happy, it's still in our DNA, I think. And yeah, I talk too much, so you feel free to, because there are other people to say so. Yeah.
Katia, would you like to follow with a question on this latest book? Because, you know, Tatiana started with that.
I just want to say, Mila to me was such an important character because she's so obviously deeply flawed, but because of that, she's so relatable to all of us because, you know, we are all humans. We all have these intrusive thoughts, may I say, and things that we don't usually show to the public. And I kind of want to go to that theme of why was it important for you to portray a woman specifically in such a raw and uncomfortable way? Like, what can we learn about ourselves through characters like Mila as a woman?
I think I partly answered, but just to continue this thought, why Mila, why that Mila, why Mila like that? My second novel finishes when Moldova gains the independence. So The Glass Garden, my second novel, it's indeed a novel about identity, about national identity, about personal identity. And the story of that character of Lastochka, it's the story of a country. You have this 10 years of becoming of a country, Moldova, because it's becoming independent after the Soviet Union dissipates. We gain back our alphabet, we gain back our language, and then it seems that everything which is good just starts now. So it's a sort of understanding that the book finishes when the good time starts, and then this last novel starts there, but unfortunately this wasn't the truth, this wasn't the reality, because with independence, with transition, which unfortunately maybe ended now, just about ended now, there was a huge time when we said that we are still in transition, and which never ended. A lot of things happened, a lot of things collapsed, and we didn't know what to do with that. So those people who fought for high stuff, high things, they just found themselves being the first ones to be discarded, because it was the time when people lost jobs, they lost money, they just went into into motion when everything they knew disappeared, but the new stuff never made sense. So this is when migration started. And I think that the first ones who were affected, and that is true for probably all ex-Soviet Union countries, were the intellectuals, of course. And they just couldn't find a place for themselves, not in their country, not in the countries they left to explore. And Mila is obviously one of those. So I think that her drama doesn't have only one layer. She wants to be maybe not a teacher, but she wants to be true to how she was raised up, to believe in studies, to believe in culture, to believe in in things, in books, in music, but she's put in the situation to do things which she never thought she will do. So I think that is I think this is her main problem in all that. So I call these people which were caught in between two worlds, I call the between generations. So that is a recurrent topic in my writing. This is the generation which never really found a place, found an identity. They are born and raised and probably will die still between two cultures at the crossroads of a country being collapsed and another one never finding a place for them. These are the people who thought they will have a bright future because they were very sought after. They had professions, they had high positions, but then the poverty just smashed all that, and they never really managed to have the same future where they left. So yeah, I think I'm just really interested in this. In these people. Maybe
why is she a woman? That was part of it.
Because the women were the first ones to be subject to leave the country. Women always need less, it seems, to so they left first because they could find the lowest jobs which were paid. They became cleaning women, they became women who take care of old people, of sick people. They were more solidar between them. I as a journalist, I filmed a lot of first migrants who were like 10 women living in a very small place, eating very little or living with very little, which probably it was easier in a way than for men. Also, I think at that time, at least being an illegal worker as a man, you could do constructions, but not maybe all the time because there are some safety. But if you are a woman and if you have access to one house, you can be underpaid, you can be humiliated, you can be whatever, raped or something, which happened quite a lot, but you will still somehow keep that job because you have to send money home because you have children. So knowing these vulnerabilities, I think women were easier to export and to keep them once you had them. I thought that we will have just a bit more fun today, but this you can't be talking about migration with so much joy.
Yeah, I think maybe something that I would add about this character and this topic is that the kind of the first wave of migration that Tatiana is talking about, that was happening in the 2000s. Maybe kind of so after the economic crisis in 1999, which was really difficult, 98, which was very difficult for Russia and like the post-Soviet countries. That's when the first wave of migration happened. And when I read your book, I also thought about my history teacher, for instance, from school. She was a brilliant teacher. I studied at one of the best schools in the capital of Moldova, at a private school, and she had to leave Moldova. She went to Italy to look after the dogs of a TV star in Italy in order to pay for the university fees of her son in Moldova. And likewise, one of my relatives, who was a very dedicated teacher, left for Italy also in the same period and ended up as a cleaning woman. So Tatiana wrote about a very kind of representative case. We are seeing that now coming from eastwards into Moldova and Romania. So people from Nepal, people from Vietnam, from the Philippines, are kind of repeating the same pattern that we have already kind of moved further away from, luckily. And something else that I wanted to notice on Mila, on Tatiana's character, is that unlike these women whom I know and who emigrated because they wanted to help their children and support them even when they were at university, so there is this kind of overbearing maternal instinct that goes all the way, until your child is employed and married. Unlike them, Mila is actually a childless woman, and that is part of her kind of drama and her loneliness in Tatiana's book.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for coming here with us, and we feel so honored to have you guys here. As a Moldovan student in this school who's never felt like Moldova's been represented enough, is really an honor for me to have you here. Because you touched upon Lastochka, the character, I'm gonna ask you a question regarding that book because that's where I read. So obviously a big theme in the novel is childhood trauma, feeling of being misunderstood, abandonment, and just parental failure overall. I know that a lot of us that come here did struggle in our childhoods, not because our parents are inherently bad, but because they themselves also had a difficult Soviet upbringing, very harsh. Love was not given through words or through actions. It was your parents working as hard as they can to make sure that you have food and you're okay. And so this theme of understanding that but maintaining that resentment towards your parents is something very interesting to me and in my own personal healing. So my question is, how do you balance portraying resentment towards parental figures with the eventual movement towards acceptance and understanding for like your own healing?
I don't I'll start with something very easy. I don't resent my parents, especially after I became a parent by myself. I think that past it doesn't have to be judged necessarily. It has to be explained. So lots of things from my childhood, which was quite happy, I would say, because I was the only child. And it's true that my parents were not very easy with words either. That was the concept those days. You don't encourage your child too much. You don't tell him that you love him too much because that will spoil him. So we successfully grew up in just by knowing that parents love us, but not necessarily hearing that. So that is the first thing which I did when I became my mother. I just applauded my children for everything by then. And then my father, for instance, that every time he saw me saying nice things to my son for little things, like, you're spoiling him, and that triggered quite a lot of things, but because he didn't really tell me that. He didn't even tell me that he likes how I write until I became a writer in 30 years. So I think that it's important to understand that the childhood described in The Glass Garden was a childhood which children didn't necessarily think it's a traumatic one, because everyone lived the same. The main frame for Soviet Union was that you have to be like the others, you have to do the same things like the others, and by that your happiness would come from the fact that you are not different, because everything was the same. We had the same clothes, we had the same textbooks, we have the same furniture at home. If you go to a Soviet block of flats, you'll know that everything is identical. Everyone had the same furniture placed in the same place because this is how it was constructed. So that gave us a sort of safety feeling that we were like the others. Lastochka indeed is a bit different. Why? Because she's adopted, but also because she does the same things like people from complete families do, but she does those things without wanting to do them. So Tamara Pavlovna, the woman who adopted her, she loves her, but she abuses her as well. While other children, when they experience the same thing from their parents, they don't feel abused because it's the mother and the father doing that. I also would like to say that I'm amazed every time when I discuss this novel with children from Moldova, like young children or like, I don't know, even students, that they don't know about how their parents grew up, how a bit older children grew up. They just don't know how many obligations and chores and things we had to do without complaining. They think that our childhood was a sort of a bit like theirs, but of course you always think that your parents are dumber or something. But when we tell them that actually children had to do a lot of things by themselves, to cook, to clean, let aside homework, it was never parents' chore to do homework or to help or to take you to your interest or activities. That is something different. And I'm always asked, is it true that children were beaten by parents at that time or spanked? And I say, yes, unfortunately, it's true, because unless it was a huge abuse, and then, of course, forces will interfere. I think every Soviet child was spanked or somehow punished physically by parents, because they didn't know better. So when I talk, at least with children, I'm not talking about past by blaming it, because I have quite a lot of reasons to blame it, but I want them to understand the context. And I think literature, rather than being edited in time, should be explained, should be put in context. We will not make the past better by taking pages written about slavery or abuse or, no, it needs to be there. It needs to be there, but it needs to be explained. And I think we do have in Eastern Europe a problem with our collective memory.
Yes.
We talk so little about important things. We were just talking before that in my family, there are 3 generations of people who had a lot to say, and they didn't talk about it. And now I just find myself with a pen in my hand, with so much burden, with so many things to talk about. My grandparents' tragedy of being deported, about my mother's tragedy of being considered a child of enemy of people and living with that, with Soviet past. No one talked about that. I don't know what you will do. What will your generation do? Because you will have to find a way of talking about everything we didn't.
So yeah, I think from your side of the family, you probably carry that responsibility of the curse breaker, the generational breaker, the one that's ready to not repeat the cycles. So when you said, because obviously we're in the topic of migration and double identity and stuff like that, you said something very interesting that related to me, which is that Lastochka only realized that her treatment was abusive from, Tamara Pavlovna, because it wasn't her biological mother, or because she had that difference of like other children just knew it's my parents. So I found that really interesting. I relate to that a lot from a migrant child perspective, because the only reason I understood that actually my childhood wasn't like perfect on paper, or the treatment that my parents had towards me, is by moving here, because back home everyone is the same, whereas here parents are very lovable, people are a lot more expressive with their words. So growing up I had a lot of trouble like taking that in, and that resentment that I was asking you about, I think only I had the resentment because I was the odd one out, you know what I mean? In this society, kids were not used to parents treating you like that, and then me seeing that was really hurtful in a way. And so it was just about accepting and knowing that my parents had it so much worse than me, and actually I'm lucky to be here and be able to break this cycle.
I think you should write a book.
I am a writer. I write poems. Okay. I write, and so you were really inspiring because we actually relate to you a lot more than you think we might. So should I continue with the? Okay, so I want to talk a bit about the post-Soviet memory and communist nostalgia. So Moldovan society has obviously been long influenced by an elite Russian-speaking cultural sphere, which is very present in the book, this pressure of learning Russian, and sometimes that creates a sense of divided identity. I know growing up, I was always taught to speak Romanian properly, to not use, Russian in my Romanian. Even in literature, I didn't really see a sphere where we had our colloquial language being used until I read your books, which obviously was really relatable. So my question is, do you think it's important for literature to represent this reality, even when it challenges idealized narratives about national culture? In writing about this cultural tension, was your approach more of a literally rebellion against dominant narratives, or an attempt to accept and portray reality as it is?
I think if this book would be written by a person younger than me, 10 years, it would be a different book. We have here Paula, who you didn't even study Russian in school anymore.
No, I did. But I can comment a bit later.
Yeah. So I always said that this story is my subjective story about my subjective childhood in my subjective Chisinau. I don't think that everyone experienced the same thing, because in the countryside the situation was different. If you had a Russian village, it would be mainly spoken Russian. If you would have a Romanian village, it would be maybe more Moldovan than Russian. But in Chisinau, Russian was the main language, because it was the capital, because it was the language of elites. And when I wrote this book, I wrote it digging up in my personal memory, and I must say that Russian for me is a second language, because I grew up, and now we don't discuss how this language came to me, forced or non-forced. The fact is that it was there. Half of my childhood was in that language. My friends, half of them were Russians, and Russian was the language which was uniting other nationalities, Ukrainians, Jews, whoever we had around us. So at home, I spoke Romanian, even not Moldovan, but Romanian. But when you would go out, you would have to speak Russian if you wanted to be, you know, of course, at school as well. Russian was the important language. If you wanted to become someone, you had to speak Russian, because it was impossible for you to be a director or someone important without paying this tribute to the language. But in the same time, when we started, fighting to regain our alphabet and we understood that this language is not ours, and now we can do something about it. But it was difficult for my generation. It was very difficult, and it's still difficult because half of our memories are sometimes linked to Russian films, to Russian music, and this war is even more complicated, but we can talk about this later. So when I wrote this book, I even went further, and I wrote it in a sort of hybrid language, because it's a language which is not completely Romanian and it's not completely Russian, but it's a language which was spoken in that time in Chisinau. It's a language with an inverse topic. So probably completely it's understood only by people born in Basarabia in that time. And I wanted to write it in that way to make it clear that for some people, these languages are completely complementary, and that this division, it's up to every person to you do it or you don't. Some people didn't do it until now. Some people still live in this at the crossroads. You know, they still think that the whole personality is built on these two languages, on this fluidity between these two cultures. Some people cut it completely in the moment they could. Generation of my parents, speaking about my father, he hated it all the time. So he managed to not to speak Russian even when he had to. So the identity it's a choice, especially when coming from places where at one point you don't have a choice. I still have at home the books written in Cyrillic alphabet, which in my house only I can read, because my children can't. It's a Russian alphabet, but it's Romanian words, and it's a hybrid language. But this was the language of all the fairy tales in my childhood. And again, if you speak about Paula here, she will, as you said, you grew up in the same district like me, but 10 years later, and it's a completely another reality. So I can't say that this book, it's about all the Moldovans in all times. It's as I said, it's a very geographically grounded, yes,
and a very kind of historically grounded story, yes. Because you describe the 80s basically in one of the most Russified districts of Chisinau, Botanica. And when I read this book, I imagined the block of flats, the Hrushchevka, in which I grew up, because this were the streets that Tatiana was describing in the Glass Garden. But I was born in 92, so the reality of the 90s was totally different. So I was encouraged by my parents to only speak Romanian. And when someone came to me, one of the kids who were speaking Russian at home came to me and tried to speak to me in Russian, I only knew one phrase in Russian, and that was, "I don't speak any Russian." So the reality was so fascinating for me to read in the like the different reality that you describe in the Glass Garden, because I understood how much history had passed in those 10-15 years that divided us. I did learn Russian at school as a second language. No, actually not as a second language, as a fourth language. So I was studying in Romanian. My second language was English that I started to study when I was 8 and still is. I speak English much better than Russian. And then I studied French, and it was only in like year 5 that I started studying Russian at school. So very different reality post-independence. And that's because my parents were part of this national liberation movement. They had just graduated university when they started to go to these literary musical clubs in the center of the city, which were advocating for speaking about deportations, about the 1946-47 state-engineered famine in Moldova, which had been taboo subjects until then. And also they were advocating for the change of script from Cyrillic to Latin, which happened in 1989, and so on and so forth. And one thing that I wanted to add as a kind of, well, in contrast to Tatiana's family, is that while in Tatiana's family, there are all of these silences that have been passed through generation to generation. In my case, it's the opposite. So I grew up, and probably this is because I'm an independence kid. So I was born after independence, and my grandma and my great-grandma felt very free to speak to me about the history of our country and our family. So I learned about history through my grandmother's stories. She was someone who refused to join the collective farms in the Soviet Union and suffered because of that. And then from my grandma, who told me about the famines, the deportations, and all of that, and only a little about that we studied at school. So a lot of my kind of national historical education comes through oral history rather than formal kind of school education.
And it's still not in school.
Yeah, it is, but not to the extent that it should be. So last year, for instance, a documentary film about deportations was screened across all of Moldova. And there was some kind of reaction against it, coming especially from the pro-Russian kind of forces, which was saying, oh, this is too violent for our kids. Although in the film you see kids being taken to Siberia, so no one asked them how they were feeling when they went there. And just to add about the kind of the generational gap, we discussed Tatiana's book, The Glass Garden, at my book club in Chisinau. And there was one woman kind of your age, so in her 20s, who said, now I finally understand why it was so difficult for my mom to move from the Cyrillic script to the Latin script, because she told me it was different, but I never could understand why. So in this respect, your book, also helped to fill those gaps of, empathy, of knowledge, because she was told about history, and about kind of these historical experiences that her mom went through, but she couldn't really fully get it because maybe, her mom is not such a good storyteller as you are. And this is where stories can kind of help us to bring us actually closer to the people around us.
So talking about that, Paula, is that the reason why you thought of writing Aici și Raiul și Iadul to kind of, bring history, oral history to the forefront from direct experiences?
Yeah, so my book, Here's Both Heaven and Hell, is very much inspired by my grandmother's kind of stories about history, but also what I tried to do in this book was to take on this kind of anti-Russian imperialist narrative that my parents' generation pushed for, and I studied at school, so my parents' generation, they studied journalism in Chisinau at State University, like Tatiana, but a bit earlier than her. And they studied Moldovan history in Russian language, even if their degree was in Romanian. And they were studying how the USSR liberated us. And then I studied a very Romanian nationalist history at my school. And I studied how I was Romanian. And then it was really hard for me to explain to people in the UK that I didn't identify as Moldovan. I identified as Romanian. And anyway, and I didn't even have a Romanian passport at the time, so that even complicated things even more. But anyway, those two kind of narratives, historical narratives, are still present in the public space in Moldova, and they are irreconcilable. So you can't have a society where people have such different views about the Second World War or about our recent history. So what I tried to do in my book was to kind of pay tribute to the suffering that previous generations of Romanian Moldovans have gone through, and talk about deportations and famine and Russification, forced Russification, and so on. But at the same time, I also wanted to give a voice to the ethnic minorities and other kind of minorities, because their stories, if you're a Roma or you're a German or German colonist, or you're Jewish, you're going to see the Second World War in a very different light to a Romanian Moldovan. And even amongst Romanian Moldovans, if you were like part of the Soviet army or you were part of the Romanian army, you know, that would have kind of given you a very different outlook on that event. And so I thought that what I can do is to kind of go and talk to these different people who had very different outlooks and experiences than my family, and give them a voice as well. And although I may not agree with their conclusions and political kind of opinions, I think that doesn't matter. What matters is to kind of, for us to listen to each other, because we are never going to agree with everyone in this room, maybe. You know, we may have very different kind of views, but we can at least listen to each other's experience and understand more about where we are coming from.
I think if I just might add, I think that partly the problem in Eastern Europe is coming from the fact that there is never a clear decision about the past, because we can't continue like that. We can't continue talking all the time in these very different terms about the war, about the aggression, about deportation, about... There is no different views on that. It should be a clear story about who killed who deported who, because I feel that now, of course, we are always under political influence of Russia, and that is the main problem in that part of the world. And whatever we do, we have to step through this, you know, sort of bloody pond of lies and manufactured truths. My personal problem with this is that as a state, we never decided to make a sort of clear, you know, position on what happened, because I know even there are writers, or there are so-called, you know, people who study the past, and then they say, of course, but it's not Russians who killed Moldovans or who deported them. It's Moldovans themselves deported other Moldovans. Not everything is so simple. There are simple things, you know, there are simple things. There is clear who is the aggressor and who is victim. And I think that if about Holocaust things have been told and people know more, even globally, about what happened there, in our part of the world, we still have a lot of gaps. As you said, like last year or 2 years ago, only we started talking about these thousands of Moldovans who were sent to Siberia, and children were somehow allowed to watch this film in schools, and they were on the national, you know, in the center near the government building. They saw this wagon full with all kind of artifacts, and people could go and touch something at least, because most of deportees are dead. Even the small children there were like 75, like my mother's age. People didn't speak about that. But then you have books, and you have researches, and you have all kind of, you know, brochures paid by when conferences organized to say that Russification never had place, that things are not like that. There is another option. I think that this is what we are missing. We don't have this collective responsibility towards the past, and no one is going to do that. Of course, we can argue that it's all down to the writers, but it's not only down to the writers. It's also about history books. It's about I don't know, little things to be explained constantly to every new generation. I think this is very important.
Thank you. Maria, would you like to ask something about the first novel? Yeah?
Perfect. So once again, thank you for coming for the event. Absolutely loved your book, The Soul of My Mother Had Green Eyes. The fact that it's been translated into English, I think it's even more important considering that it focuses on like immigrants within London. And I think, as we've touched on before, like your theme of intergenerational like relations and trauma, I couldn't help noticing that within this book, the protagonist, Alexei, he is a named character, but his mother and grandmother remain nameless throughout. Personally, I view this as a reflection of how the stories of first-generation immigrants, especially that of women, tend to remain silent, as you mentioned before. And essentially, they are silenced by the societies that they have attempted to integrate in. But I did want to know regarding this book in particular, whether that was essentially your understanding of choosing whether to name the female characters or not, and whether kind of my understanding correlates with yours.
Yeah, I think that the mother's name is Mother in the book and in the next book, and I just felt that this book was so it's a cosmopolitan book, you know, it happens everywhere, so many nationalities, so many layers in that book, because I was a fresh migrant myself, so I just wanted to integrate, or better said, to run away from my geography. I didn't really want to write about Moldova. I wasn't interested in Moldovan stories, and that I'm saying with a bit of shame, because that's maybe why we don't know so much about past, because when you are able to write, and then you are gaining a voice, well, you don't really do anything with it. Or now I've changed. I think the writing itself changed me. I became more aware of this need to talk about the past while I became more successful as a writer, but that's another conversation. So this first book, I'm glad that you say that it's a book about migration. I never thought it's going to be a book about migration, so probably this is another way of saying that when you write a book which talks to the audience, it can be a book about anything, because it can be about book about love or hate or migration, or a book about relationships, intergenerational problems. So for me, the mother in the book is very important, and I love her very much, because it was, to a certain extent, myself. I was a mother when I wrote that book. I had a small child at the time, so lots of my fears and my how shall I say, prejudices about this institution of maternity went into that book. But I think that it was somehow a book about my father in a way, and me seeing him being such a good father with my children, a grandfather, a role which suited him much more than a role of a father, somehow made me understand his mistakes. And then now I understand him even better, because I'm starting making those mistakes myself. So I think even if it's a book about the mother, it was a sort of lot of inversed roles there. And also somehow it was like a cry to say that not only women have to grow up, to bring up children, not only women are to blame for children's, unsuccesses or unhappinesses. And also probably I wanted to say that people don't always know how to love correctly, especially if they haven't experienced this when they were children. And we talked about this at the beginning of this evening. There are people who never were told that they are loved, and then it's their turn to do this. They just don't know. They don't have this basic skill to give love. And I wanted to write this letter in a form of a book to my son, maybe to other children, to say this. But if you think it's not enough, here it is. This is the demonstration of my love. This is as good as it gets from me. And if it's not enough, you should do it better. You should. So yeah.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add, whilst I was reading the book, my mom would actually pick up the book and she actually finished it before me. So I think it actually kind of, I don't know, it just showed that idea of like intergenerational relations and how within the book, obviously like the trauma between Alexei and his mother, in the end, it kind of brings them together. And yeah, I think it reminded me of a quote from Elif Shafak in her own book where she said, parents are the bones that children sharpen their teeth on. And I think these characters perfectly portray that. I think, as you said, like no one teaches you how to love. Some people never really understand like who loves them, when they will be loved. And I just want to really like appreciate the complexity of the characters. Like Alexei as a narrator, he's not a bad guy, he's not a good guy. His mother isn't the villain, isn't the hero. It's just a really realistic portrayal of that. So I think this wasn't a question, but as you said, the fact that you based it on your own kind of your son, your father as well, I think it's just a really great reflection of real life, basically.
And I think that it was really important for me to, when I was making up their story, their family story, because we are used in literature, to have a very, somehow, if you want to make a sad story, you will have a very traumatic family. If you want to make a love story, you just place it in a nicely drawn picture. My characters are not coming from a poor family. They're not coming from, they have money. They are normal people. And that was something important for me to show that the unhappiness is not related to status, to money. You can be very happy in a poor family because love is not something which you can buy. And this book is around the idea of communication. Everything which is not said is just like a grave. And then on that, you just put layers of frustration and unhappiness. But the moment you find time to actually talk to the person in front of you, you will understand that sometimes half of your problems are being solved only by communication. And unfortunately for the characters of this book, someone had to die, but not always this is the case. I needed something to shorten, to make the book a bit more active. So the mother, I'm not spoiling it for you, by the way, because it's clear from the first page that she's dying. So the mother is dying and they have some time together. And that time is not spent with anything spectacular. They're doing the most banal things. They're just making popcorn, they're observing butterflies, they're drinking beers, and they're talking. So it can be a sickness, not a death. It can be anything, but it shouldn't be necessarily something. It's just this time they took to talk to each other. I think that the boy in the book says at one point, I'm unhappy that the mother didn't start to die before. Sooner, yes. Because basically they understand that they wasted so much time of life by not talking, and they just take this last months for doing that. But I'm very happy when I know lots of people come to a book signing saying like, this book is for my son whom I didn't speak for 10 years, or this book is for my mother because I want her to know, or this book is for my friend, or I read this book and I forgave my parents even if I are dead for 10 years. I think this is important, and it's not about me anymore as an author. It's about the book itself. It's about these two mother and son who actually reach up and tell this story in different languages to people who need it maybe in that moment. And it was enough, even if I wrote it only for that,
It's so interesting to hear you talk about this book as a as a kind of lack of communication, or that being the kind of running theme, because for me, this story was about losing your capacity to love and then finding it again. And when I read it and thought about it in that way, I was like, oh my God, Tatiana has just answered the most important question on earth, you know, and like wrote this book about the most important thing in our lives. Because he does say, Alexei, at the beginning of the book, that he hates his mother, and then he learns to love her again. And he's a teenager, and that matters because, you know,
I have a teenage son. You know, I have a teenage son now, so he didn't read the book yet. Maybe that's why we are still in good, terms. But I do feel that this book doesn't need it doesn't need a recommendation. You know, I'm very glad when people just find one little thing and just solving. I mean, having a relationship with one aspect of a book. I know it's recommended sometimes in therapy, and I know that sometimes people can't finish it, and I know that sometimes people can't do anything else until they finished it. For me, it was the same writing it, but I just feel that that book was my luck as well, because when I finished it, I felt that I just said everything I needed to say in a way which is simple. In our family, we didn't really like talking, but we were all writers. So even between me and my father, we always communicated through writing, you know, like all kind of notes, like letters. Words spoken seemed to be a bit too much. And I think that in a sort of very shameful way, I wanted to write a book so good that my father will finally say, you are a writer. And he did. He didn't died, but he did. So I think that on many levels, this is a very simple book, because it was nothing special about the plot. I don't know how many of you read it, but the plot is not new. The setting is not new. Nothing is new in this book. It's just my fury, I think, my urge of writing it. And I'm very happy to hear from some people that they had an urge to finish it because they just wanted to get rid of it. So that's, I think.
Yeah, I think what kind of struck Romanian audiences was that it's so brutal. And you and I were talking about this at some point, that in Moldova, for instance, there is this cult of the mother that was promoted by our national poet, Grigore Vieru. And Tatiana comes and she kind of destroys that. And
poems about the mother, because you need all kind of feelings towards the mother. And I love my mother, you know, we are very good friends.
I love that you have to say that all the time. After writing about very difficult kind of relationships with mothers or fathers. But also what Romanian readers really loved about this book, and also Spanish readers. So in Spanish, this book was sold in more than 150,000 copies. Huge. And it was made into a kind of theater play, 2 theater plays there and in Romania and so on. But what people loved was the style, the poetic style of this book. People can hear you. What people really loved about this book is the style, the very, very poetic style, which is close to another actually Romanian migrant writer called Aglaia Veterane, who lived in Switzerland and kind of traveled with her parents' circus. But she's a kind of strange marginal writer in Romanian literature, and Tatiana's love for her brought her in some way, or like some of her, into the mainstream, and I think that's really beautiful.
Maybe just to go back to the topic of migration really quick, many immigrants describe reaching a moment where their identity feels blurred, so they no longer fully belong to the country they left, but they are not entirely at home in the new one either. So I wanted to ask if maybe both of you as well, if you've experienced this sense of being between worlds, and maybe how has it influenced your writing?
Oh no. Okay. So I remember we were in a conversation at Radio Romania Cultural with Tatiana, and she said, "Oh, Paula feels comfortable anywhere, and I feel like I'm not at home in any place." And I thought, well, that's not exactly how I feel. I don't feel like I'm at home everywhere, but I do in some way. So I moved back to Moldova after 12 years in the UK in 2022. Partly because I wanted to be with my family when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, and I felt like there was a lot of detachment towards that event here, although there were Ukrainian flags everywhere. But my housemates, for instance, would tell me not to listen to the news so much. So then I was like, okay, I think maybe I want to be with my family now. But also as a journalist, there was more international interest in Moldova than ever. Not just for our present, but also for our past, for the topic of deportations, for instance, because now the world kind of understands that that story is repeating once again in Ukraine, that our past is kind of not just in textbooks, but is in the news headlines. And so since I've been in Moldova, I have discovered that it's not really fully a home either, because in some ways I was shaped as an adult woman here, because I came here to study the IB, so my last 2 years of school, and then I studied at uni and then worked here. And so, of course, while here I was kind of seen as being kind of more direct. There I feel like I'm a lot more polite than other people are. And I'm doing like driving lessons now, and I've struggled so much with this kind of Soviet masculinity that my driving instructors are showing. And you know, they are these type of parents, I guess, that you were talking about, who say, "Oh, you will never do anything, you can't do it." And I'm like, aren't you meant to like give me confidence that I can learn how to drive? Yeah. And so, yes, of course, there are all of these kind of cultural differences and kind of moments of discomfort in London, as well as in Chisinau, as well as in other places. But then isn't that what being alive is?
Well, in my experience, I speak now as a journalist and as a writer and as a migrant. There are two types of migrants. The migrants who then they shut the door at home in their country, which they live. They just leave everything behind. And then they go to another country. They don't want anyone to know where are they coming from, what was in the past, and they want to be fully integrated. First thing they do, they try to fake the accent of that country. So they become a new person in a new country. And there are people who never leave anything behind, and they're just like huge snails, you know, gigantic snails who just take everything, like food, everything, smells, memories, handkerchiefs, everything they have, and they go in a new country. They put an imaginary flag on their door and say, "This is me, this is my country within this country." I think in my case, it's not a thing which I take with me when I move, because I move quite a lot now, less, but before I had the feeling that I'm always moving. But it's a state of mind. I feel at home where I feel useful. I have 2 children. They are teenagers, so they still need me in many ways. So as long as someone is bugging me and someone is asking me, where are my, I don't know, shoes, where's the food, why the door is not open, I feel that I have a role, and I have my garden, and I don't put that imaginary flag, because for that I have a writing, right? And when I started writing, I thought that I did the same thing. I left everything behind. But now I see that the strength of my voice as a writer is coming from where I was born, is coming from Moldova, is coming from Romanian languages. More and more, is more powerful in my writing. And even if I don't write about that part of the world, I think everything I ate in my childhood and every song I heard and every fairy tale, it's somehow transpiring from my writing. And that is something I never thought I will be like, but you don't know how you are going to be transformed as a writer, because that is a job which doesn't have a fixed program. So you just change with your writing. I think that if tomorrow I would move to another country, everything else will be changed, but the way I write it will be still there.
I mean, if I'm not wrong, you started writing after you need If I'm not wrong, you started writing after you immigrated to France. So was that maybe like a trigger in, like, is there any correlation between you immigrating and you starting to write?
In my case, it was a very simple explanation, because I didn't have anyone to speak Romanian with. And at one point, when you speak a lot, you understand that you are physically missing your language. And that's a very weird thing, to miss your language. If you think about it, it's like, what do you mean you miss? But at that time, we didn't have Zooms. We didn't have, I had to call my parents, like actually spending money on the call. And I remember first time I was calling my father, the first sentence was always like, don't speak too much, because, you pay money. So it's immediately something which you need to think about. So you structure your thing. So first thing you say, I'm healthy. I'm there, everyone is all right. And then if you have like half a minute, you say, how are you? Okay, good, bye. Now it's different. And again, I think that technology, if this is I was thinking about this when I was writing the last book, the technology changed so much the notion of migration. I have friends who do everything together with their mothers. They could just call each other in the morning and they can cook together, they could iron together. It's like you have your mother at home without being at home, and that makes life so much easier. Lots of people who work here and their role here is to send money back home, they do feel much better because they have this contact with grandchildren, with children. So it's not so difficult, because the first wave of migration, they didn't have that. And imagine not only not seeing your child for 5-6 years, because this is what happened with the first migration. Some women left children, they were first year of school and they came back, then they were at university. And that is, just imagine that the only thing you know about your mother is that once a month she sends you some package with some sweets or something. That is I think this is a huge tragedy, and we didn't fully yet studied the effects of that migration. But now it's much easier. So migration became a healthy choice now, because knowing that you can return home anytime makes it much easier to live abroad than it used to be. And I hope one of you will want one day to study how those children who grew up without parents, only with grandparents, or sometimes with neighbors in villages which completely were stripped of adults at one point, how did they grow up? What is for them lack of love from parents, or that orange and Haribo sent every week, that was enough? So you see, I think that we still have a lot to explore in literature or not. Sorry.
Yeah, if I could ask a question. So did you manage to pass your language or languages down to your kids as well?
They do speak badly Romanian, and they speak mostly when my mother is coming. Mm-hmm. And that is quite shameful for a writer, who writes in Romanian, to say that. But I know that I'm afraid to force a language, even if it's mine, the children. They do speak other Latin languages, because I live in France, so they speak French, of course, they speak Spanish, and they do have notions of Romanian, but I don't see this thing. And it's sad in a way, because thinking about my father's generation, who fought, for them language was the way of life. They would die for language. My father would have died if someone would say, if you die today, but tomorrow Romania will become like, he would say, of course, just because this was his principle. And then we didn't care so much about that, because for us, learning as many languages as we can was very important. And for children of migrants, sometimes it's just a tool of keeping in touch with grandmothers. But if they come to live with them, not even that. So I don't judge either way, but it's again a choice, I think.
So yeah, I mean, we are in the Romanian community and Moldovan, of course, in the UK, trying to promote the idea of passing the language down to the second and third generation. If we don't do that, it might disappear at some point in the diasporic community. So one of the things we do is try to set up this GCSE in Romanian, which is an exam which would be optional, first of all, that you can take at 16. But we do find the community is divided between these two attitudes. One, the kind of migrant you described earlier, who left everything behind. They're now British and that's it. No need to speak Romanian. And the other ones that are, trying their best, like you said as well, to pass it down, even if it's not perfect, because it's not easy to learn a language abroad. So yeah, that's why I asked you. And could I ask you one more question? In your last novel, I wrote down a quote from there, and it would be nice if you want to discuss it. You said, scrisul ca un medicament sau ca o răzbunare. I'll say it in English as well. Writing as medicine or as revenge. How do you relate to that?
I think that writing can be anything you want, really. There is no correct way of looking at writing. Lots of people speak about writing as a sort of therapy or healing. It never worked for me like that. I think that writing for me, it's never been just an instrument to deal with myself. It was, even if it's nearly an intimate act, but I think that once you know that you will be published, or once you know that you are writing a book which will be published, you can't pretend that it's only for yourself. And I never met any writer who had already published a book who pretends to write for himself. It's no way. I mean, if you want to write for yourself, you just write in the kitchen and just burn the thing. But if you don't, you do want to be published. So, and if you do want to be published, then the second question is, of course, who do you write for? What do you want to do in writing? For me, writing proved to be a very useful tool of making peace with the past, with making things right with people, things I didn't say in time, or things I wished I would have done differently maybe. I feel that, when you are writing, it's your playground and you can actually do whatever you want. And I feel that even for my generation, writing is a way of reconnect, a way of create an identity even, and but again, for everyone it can be something completely different. Paula, what is for you? You didn't even listen.
No, I did, but while you were speaking, I was actually thinking that what I admire about your writing, amongst many kind of qualities, is that I actually see some therapeutic kind of instrument. I see you use literature as a therapeutic instrument, as well as many other things, as well as a kind of communications tool, because you are addressing very deep fears, and you are talking about like very intimate memories as well, and thoughts and so on. And I admire that. But I do also love what you say about the fact that there's freedom about what writing means to you, because like my dad, for instance, used to say that you have to be unhappy in order to write, and I would be like, no, you can be whatever. It's fine.
Well, it never worked for me. You know, it's true that there is this consensus that writers are miserable, poor, drunks, and half addicted people. I find that I can't write if everything else is not sorted out, you know, and probably this is a sort of journalistic or even, let's say, a woman's approach to things. You first do your things and then you clean your mind, and then you do other things. Maybe for someone it's pleasure writing, but for me it's not necessarily pleasure. But I can't, if I know that I need so many other chores to do, I just can't write. I can't focus. So I even said once in an interview, and that backfired lots of times, not very well for me, like, I need to be happy when I write. And then people say, what? I mean, look what you're writing, how can this be true? But it's true. I need to be at least at ease with myself. I need to be content and, you know, to write, because when I write, it takes energy. It's not easy to write. It's not easy to expose yourself in such a way that not everything is only about yourself. And but it's we can talk about writing and what writing means and who is, you know, who has to write and who has to not, for many hours. But sometimes when I go in schools or universities, people say, like, you know, I write not something specific. I just write. I write every day. I have thousands of journals since I'm 17, and that's amazing, because that's probably something she needs to do, or he needs to do, in order to feel that that day had a sort of closure. And I don't know if this is a therapy or not, but for some people, indeed, it's easier to do other things. My son, for instance, he has very good friends, and they all communicate online. And sometimes at school, they meet, but then they come home and I see them going online and playing a game and then talking interesting stuff, actually, and say, why don't you go out? Because you're all neighbors. You just go on the street. And they don't want to, because that is, you know, probably for them this personal touch, or it's more difficult. And I was thinking, in a way, I'm the same. I prefer to write rather than explain my writing. So it's very different for everyone.
I just wanted to add, because you were speaking about writing as a kind of process of exposing yourself. I thought maybe it would be interesting for the audience, because our topic today is identity, migration, and so on, that you were just saying that at Hatchards, where you had your kind of book launch and your English family came to see you, and they are now finally able to kind of read your first novel in English. You were saying that you kind of felt naked and that you don't have a secret life anymore.
It was a moment that I waited for a long time, because I postponed English translation for years. And now, after all these languages, it seems a bit silly not to have a book translated to English, especially my husband is British. So, you know, but I think that in my mind, that had a reason, because indeed now the first reader of a book was my husband. And it was very weird for me to see him reading the book, because I was thinking, what if he doesn't like it? Well, how do you come out of this? Like, it was something which I kept only for myself. It was the writing. And for many years, in the country I live, in the circle of our friends, no one knew that I'm writing. No one. I was just saying, like, I used to be a journalist, and people don't really ask. The fact is that people don't really want to know who you are when you just meet at the school or at the market. They're just like, you know, she's there. And now everyone knows. And I feel that I am indeed like walking naked on the street, because everyone knows I'm a writer. They all bought the book. And I'm sure I have a feeling that constantly people talk behind my back, like, did you read? Did you read? Did you read? And yes, so Tim, my husband, said that he liked the book, and then he said, like, I really liked it. And I felt that he was happy as well that he liked it. Because he'd read it the same thing. What if he doesn't?
He can stay your husband.
Yeah, so we are still
You
married.
can stay married.
I'm saying this, it's a bit banal, I know, but I'm saying this that because the writing can be, you know, what Virginia Woolf was calling the room on your own, a profession, a passion can be for a person, the hiding place. And it's so important that we all have it, be it, I don't know, like making teas or drawing or writing. It's very important. And it takes courage to open up that very personal place for other people to come. And it was so much easier to be a journalist because I was doing the asking. I was the one who asked questions. And even if you are sort of famous or known, which in Moldova is not difficult because Moldova is very small, so of course you can be popular very fast because it's very small. But it was a different kind of popularity because people see you as an anchor woman. I did anchoring for some years, but they don't really need to know about you because they see your face and that's it. But now everyone somehow wants to know things from my life. What do I eat? How do I write? What color am I, you know, hyacinths? And that is dreadful for a writer. It's difficult and not everyone can do it well, but I suppose that not everyone can be Elena Ferrante, and I envy her a lot because she can just write, or he can just, because I think it's a man, but no one needs to meet and ask things. You are also a writer, you can.
I did have another question, which I hope to have the chance to say later, but what you were talking about actually reminded me. So initially when I started to read Grădina din Sticlă, I didn't realize that it wasn't your own story. I read half of the book thinking, wow, this woman is incredible. She's been through like so, I mean, I still think you're incredible, but just like the raw, I was genuinely like, just in awe of like how well you were able to portray these raw emotions. To genuinely, I was crying. I was thinking like, I want to hug her and I want to say like, I'm so sorry like about all of this. And so now that you're saying that actually you need to be happy when you're writing, I'm just wondering, how does that work? Like, how are you able to like portray these emotions where they are so believable and the reader can feel it so deeply whilst actually you are in a very good state of mind? What do you have any approach to this, or is it just a natural ability?
I mean, how do actors act? I think that a quality of an intellectual should be the ability of feel other people's pain. And I used to be a journalist, you know, so if I worked as a journalist for like lots of my youth, I mean most of my youth, and I think that I luckily or unluckily, I don't know, but I was a journalist in the time of a country when everything was falling apart. So orphanage, like lots, like human trafficking, poverty. So when you go every day and talk about this, and I was your age, so imagine being 20 and seeing every day, I don't know, people dying, people being left abused, raped, and you have to do this professionally. I think that cannot leave a trace, you know, and I thought it didn't, because for a long time I was feeling very, you know, composed, and that I could, I even thought that I'm very good at going and just extracting the main thing from a drama without being soapy or something. But then when I grew, I became older, I became a mother, you can't, things never disappear. And I suddenly found myself very vulnerable and reacting to the same things in different ways, thinking because I have a child now, or becoming a migrant. And even if you are, you know, a very lucky migrant, you still feel things like loneliness, frustration, humiliation, when you go in a new country and you want to buy a bread for yourself, and then the person who is selling you the bread looks at you like saying, oh, but you said it in a, you know, your language is not quite, and all those things, of course, they breach you, and you become vulnerable. So I think that the writing, it's about vulnerability. There is a long debate about who should be writing books and who should not, who should be writing about big traumas and tragedies and who should not, whether a person who is a survivor of a concentration camp is the one who should write a book about that, or a very talented writer should be writing because he will know how to present that to a broader audience. I don't know. It depends. I think readers should be the ones who decide. That's why I said that title of "I have to be happy," it's a bit overreacted. Maybe not happy, but I have to have the energy to treat the topics of my book with seriosity, because what I'm most scared when I write is that talking about migration or talking about abuse, you can't make a trivia about it. You can't treat it superficially, and if you don't feel apt, don't do it. That's my rule. I think that's the only rule which I have for literature. More and more writers are afraid to write about, let's say, big topics because of that, and then they end up with a lot of para literature, with a lot of pseudo literature where people just tackle something, but then they don't go deep. And I think that's worse than not writing it. I believe that you can't write about wars or suffering or other people's tragedies just making a social project of your book just because it's a topic which will bring you a prize or something. I feel the responsibility about my writing, and that doesn't come from the beginning, but it slows you down as a writer, but I think it pays off by being more responsible.
So I guess linking this idea to kind of what we talked about translation, I know you mentioned Elena Ferrante, huge fan of her, and I'm just a huge fan of translated fiction in general, for example, like Han Kang. And I think in the past few years, we've seen this gradual rise in translated fiction and nonfiction. So obviously when I found out that your book was getting published in English, it's really a fantastic thing, because usually the books that are written in Romanian tend to be by male authors, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But seeing that literature in itself has historically been a male-dominated field, I think it's just really important to have these authors of Eastern European kind of heritage and identities. And even a little fun fact regarding like the Nobel Prize in Literature, of the 15 women who have received it, 6 are actually from Eastern or Central Europe. And regarding both you, Tatiana and Paula, you've both won awards and prizes for your own works. And I guess I wanted to ask the both of you, how do you view the future for Eastern European female authors, even in regard to the Moldovan or Romanian publishing industries, or essentially the global publishing industry as a whole?
So one of the projects that I'm really proud of having done is a 3-part anthology called Century of Romanian Poetry Written by Women, where Alina Porcaru, a poet and future novelist, and I selected poems written by almost 100 female poets who have written in Romanian language over the past century. And when we started this project in 2018, there were lots of people around us, including female poets, who told us, you're not going to find anyone, or like half of the people in your anthology are not going to be kind of worth it. And now no one says that anymore. And we did 3 volumes, and that's because we built something and we showed that, look, actually the problem is that it's not that women didn't write. It's that their writing was forgotten in time. Somehow the kind of literary hierarchies were made without them. But our project was not unique in that way. Of course, feminism now is kind of mainstream. Thank you, Beyonce. And so in Romania at the same time, there was a women's literary prize that was founded. And then lots of other kind of initiatives were happening at the same time. So now if you actually look at the kind of best-selling books in Romanian bookshops, a lot of them are written by female authors. And that's amazing. And the kind of literature that we have in Romanian now, written by both men and women, is going through a golden age, I think. And same goes for Eastern European literature. We've seen Laszlo Krasnohorkai or Georgi Gospodinov getting these huge prizes recently. And I think it's really, or like Olga Tokarczuk, it's really exciting. And there is, we do share a history and realities and some common references, although now, of course, in Eastern Europe, we are a bit more fragmented, and or at least until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we knew more about New York than we knew about like neighboring countries. That is changing now with the war and also with European integration. But yeah, I'm very optimistic about the future of kind of Eastern European literature. I hope that we will have this kind of glorious phase like Latin American literature. And what I really hope we have is, the kind of respect and love for literature that Latin American audiences have for their authors. Tatiana can speak more about this because she has been to Mexico, to Guadalajara twice, and it's just the kind of size of audiences there who come to literary events is something else that puts Europe to shame.
Yes, it's true that I am very optimistic for once at least about the women's voice in literature. I think because Paula mentioned, I think it's amazing what's happening in Latin America. We are looking now at an absolutely amazing trend of fantastic women's writers there. I am a big fan of Latin American literature. I think there are a lot of stories untold in Eastern Europe. I would be very happy as a reader, because luckily writers have to be readers as well from time to time. I would be very happy if those stories would be told in general, because we are missing, we talked about this all day, we are missing important bits of our history, and that could be only retrieved through talking. I think Romanian literature is amazing. I can't recommend it enough. I think it's very varied. I think we have different voices which are talking about different things. Generations stepped in with completely new blood and interests, and it's not anymore that unclear literature, whether it's only Latin, whether it has something extra. We don't speak only about communism. I would very much like, if you remember one thing from this meeting, is don't think that Romanians only can speak about communism in their literature. No, it's not true. There are writers who are amazing. I'm thinking now, for instance, Mircea Cărtărescu is from Romania, but he doesn't write about those things which people think that Romanians write about. And it's so many new voices. I'm from Moldova. That means that, for instance, topics which we discussed today about Russia, for instance, is more present in my work, but there are Hungarian writers from Romania, there are Serbian writers from Romania. It's plenty, and I really encourage you to look for those writers and to read. And I think that Romanian literature today will not disappoint you. And I will just use this moment to say thank you very much for Romanian Cultural Institute here in London, because it doesn't matter if you have a very good literature if there are no mechanism to promote, to talk about it. And meetings as we have here today, they are amazing, because I trust that you will talk about Romanian literature. And thank you very much for organizing this meeting today.
You're very welcome. So, Cristina, last question, and then we move on to questions from the audience.
Okay, it's going to be very quick. I'm sorry, I understand it's been a long day. So, when I asked you about how you managed to write, you talked a lot about this empathy gained through being exposed to suffering, which I think a lot of people from Eastern Europe, I don't want to make a comparison, but I think we tend to be quite deep in the sense of like just very aware emotionally. And I do think that comes from a lot of collective suffering and a lot of generational trauma. And when it comes to future generations, so what kind of responsibility do you think we carry so when it comes to this inherited trauma? So what kind of responsibility towards the generation that came before us, you know? And then how can we ensure that emotional depth and identity are built not only through suffering, but also through empowerment and conscious growth, if that makes sense? I hope it does.
As you said, it's been a long day. I don't know what's the recipe for, unburdening yourself or how to pay off for the, what hasn't been done. But I would say that I would encourage young generation to talk to the survivors, to talk to old people, to talk to them, just to fish those stories. I started doing this a couple of years ago. Every time I go to Moldova, I go to village. I talk to people, to old people. They are an amazing source of stories. Some of them talk only now. Some of them never have been asked. Some of them were afraid to talk. So that is a resource which hasn't been used in Eastern Europe. And I think that those of you who still have grandparents or relatives, just talk to them. Just make place for story at the dinner table. That can pay off great deal.
And also it's better than discussing or like exchanging political opinions.
That never solves never solve that.
So we're going to move to questions from the audience, both in the room and online. But just promise us that you're already working on your next projects. Is that so? Yeah, good. Are you working on your next book already?
Yes,
yeah, good, great.
I've said that so many times, but I'm gonna not say it again. I do work on a book, and I hope I will be good enough to finish it because it's one of those topics we discussed today. It's about the deportations in Moldova, and it's been such a long way to me to decide to write this book, and I'm a bit scared that it's such an important topic, and I just don't want to, to not to do justice to it. So we'll talk about it when it comes.
Yeah, and Paula as well.
So I've written a novel about being a young Romanian woman in London. So all of the
lovely.
topics
We're
we've talked about. So I'm just finishing that.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so we'll take questions from the audience. One from the room and one from online, so you can send your questions online as well.
Hello, Victoria Demici, EBRD Knowledge Hub. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. This week was a pure joy and bliss, and I'm even more happy, and I'm even happier because I moved to London 15 years ago from Moldova to do a master's degree at UCL, and I remember my cognitive dissonance on the first week at UCL when the professor said that only 3% of the entire world population lives in a different country than the country where they were born. And I went on JSTOR to double check if the professor was right, because I was coming from Moldova, and in Moldova, every single family we knew had someone who was working abroad. And I was like, something's wrong there. And then this week and the weeks preceding this week, we were discussing on panels like this that only 3% of the books that are being sold in the UK are translations. Again, we're shrinking down. So how do you find motivation to still write when your voice comes from that demographics of 3%? And the books that are translated are those 3% of the books on the shelves. And this age of AI, where we are all in this instant gratification disease, and we're scrolling down and have this 6-second span of attention, how do you find motivation to still write for people who still have one whole day to read a book?
Do you want to answer first, Paula? When I don't know what to say, I'm asking Paula.
Well, Tatiana got translated in 20 languages, so she can't speak for those writers who haven't been translated in other languages. But what I will say that you mentioned AI, and I go to a lot of kind of literary festivals and book fairs and so on, and I really love meeting people who love literature just as much as I do. But then I also, because that gives me some hope that actually the book industry will survive and literature will survive. One of the colleagues of my generation, Alexandru Bordean, was saying at some point that he thinks books will become like this huge cathedrals in which people just go and kind of look from time to time, but no one kind of reads the books all the time. And we can see that, our attention spans are shrinking because of social media and the so-called smartphones. And that is a worry. That is my worry, actually, that we will all become more stupid because we would kind of outsource our thinking to ChatGPT, and we won't be able to kind of read nuanced, complex stories and thinking. But I don't know, there was a kind of a story of decline being told when ebooks first appeared, and we still have a book industry. So hopefully AI won't, kill reading either.
So, okay, so Maria, can you, yeah. We don't have a question from online, so we could continue in the room.
I was going to ask a completely different question, which I might later if there's time, but just a comment on that 3% statistic, because it's a flat statistic. If you go into any bookshop in London, any good bookshop, if you go into the LRB bookshop or into Foyles or into many Waterstones or any local indie bookshop, and you look on the fiction shelves, you will find about 30-40% in translation. So for me, although I take the point about it being an exact statistic, it's very misleading because people who are reading books are actually able to have a much wider choice. And I just wanted to say that because I hate this negativity which has been coming out for 10 years. Oh, it's 3%. I don't think it is 3%. I think it's way, way higher in terms of people who bother to read. Maybe if I have time for a question later, I will ask as one of the old people here, referring to what you were saying. Or maybe I'll say it very quickly, because I remember talking to my grandmother who died when I was 5. And so I have stories from her going back to before the First World War. And now I'm almost 75, and I still have that story in me. So there's a span of way over 100 years. And that's part of our present, actually. It's not part of the past, it's part of the present. That's why it is fantastic to hear you saying that you're going to villages and recording and listening, because those are where extraordinary things happen. Sorry, it's not a question. It's neither of my, I just had 2 comments, forgive me.
Thank you very much. Just to say quickly about the translation. I don't think that writers write with the idea in their mind that they have to be translated. It's fine not to be translated. It's fine to write in your language. It's fine to be read by 3 people, but maybe those 3 people will do something with that book, and that book will become their book, the book of their life. There are so many better writers than me who have never been translated, but they're part of our culture. And maybe reading their books in Romanian when I was young made me, I don't know, is part of my writer's flesh, right? So not everyone will be translated, but that's not the main thing. I think that there is a beautiful connection of a writer with the language he writes in. So I have a book which is not translated, my first book, and I don't want it to be translated because I think that it has to remain only in the language it was written, because I don't think it will tell so much to people in other cultures or in other languages, but it's mine, and it's the first step for the second one or third one. I think that what we forget is that before us, before social media, before this kind of progress where everyone can publish, everyone can write, everyone can become a writer overnight, we had so many wonderfully beautiful, amazing writers who enriched local cultures but have never been known. Sometimes, because we speak other languages, for instance, we find a very old writer in, I don't know, who published only in Bulgarian, and then you say, he's so good. He's so good. He deserved to be translated in all the languages, but he was never, probably he will not be. But he's still part of that culture. And you mentioned Grigori Vieru before, and of course you have those who hate him, and of course you have those who loved him. And of course some of his poems today may seem very naive, not they can't be placed in today's literature very high at least. But for us, without him in that time, we wouldn't be the same people. We wouldn't, it was just like that important soil you put it there on a plant in order to make it stronger, even if it dissipates and it doesn't remain. But for me, some of his poems have a special beauty, and it's like the same beauty like baked bread at home, even if, of course, 90% of the poets today are better or more interesting than he was. So this is about translations, you know.
We have a question from online. So, as writers, you're ambassadors for the human spirit. Is that difficult in a time of dissociation, of depersonalization, to convince people to gaze inward and to gaze into the interior of others?
Okay. To convince people to gaze inward and to gaze into the interior of others. I don't think if reading the third time it will help me. Depersonalization. What does this mean in writing? We always depersonalize ourselves.
I think it's more about how we currently live in a very social media orientated world where instead of us taking the time to figure out what do I like, what do I want, who am I, what are my preferences, you see everything and you think this is how I should be, this is what is cool, and this is what the trend and how my personality should look like. So then you take that on board and you try to mold yourself into, you know, what you think that you should be. So I think the question is probably about a lot of your raw characters as well, which are not, they might not be something you see everywhere, but that raw humanity and that vulnerability is what makes them so important in an era like this, where we're all starting to blend into the same things.
You were speaking so well, but I nearly, I was just listening. I would say that literature doesn't have a high purpose in general. I think that we forget that literature also can be just a pleasure. It can be nice to read, and it doesn't have to be always something very profound. Or it can be, you can read the book and have just one image left, and that image can be your candle for dark days. You know, it doesn't have to be all the time a motivation, or you don't have to write down half of a book. Personally, when I write, I don't want to be a moralist. I don't want to give advices or recipes. I don't want to be right. I just have a story to say, and I say it with my own possibilities as good as I can. My characters are never good or bad. They don't do only the right things. Paula looks at me with this. I know that some of my characters from the last book Paula hates, but I still wanted them to be like that, because you can still find those kinds of people in life. If we start writing only correctly and only about good things, and all the time being very careful to to give to the reader the assurance that we are good people ourselves. That is not literature anymore. Literature should provoke you. Literature should annoy you. To any feeling, anything which you get from literature is good, because that means that you are alive and that it provoked something. Otherwise, we can just read textbooks and then it's good as well. But for me, literature has never been about being correct. It has to have a sort of crazy thing in it, or that's creativity. That's art for me.
Yeah. So that's in itself. You don't try to be relatable. You just write. I think that's what answers the question itself.
Thank you. Can you come with me to Moi? Yes.
I just wanted to add that I was an activist before. I became an activist in Moldova, but also in London at some point when our local elections were declared null by the Supreme Court during Plahotniuk's dictatorship. That's when I kind of started going to more protests and getting more involved in a diaspora kind of political movement here. And that past kind of haunts me because now, activists would kind of come to me and get annoyed by some of the stuff I write because it doesn't coincide with what they think, should be told about a certain place or a certain kind of story that has made it into the news. But I think there's so much to learn from like personal experience and from people's actual stories that you can pause your opinion. Like one of my recent hobbies is actually not having opinions, and just listening. Just listening and being curious and open to what the other who's next to you has been through and how they got to where they are. And yes, you may have totally different political opinions, but not everything is about political opinions because those are borrowed anyway most of the time.
I also wanted to say, just people all the time have a tendency to think that writers, they are born and they have to stay unchanged all their lives, but that's impossible. Writing is not a job. It's not like you go to a medical school and you learn where's the heart, where's the lungs, and then you know that they're there forever. It's not like that. The writer is a living person. He changes because life around it changes. Sometimes, and I could say about myself, I thought that I will never want ever to comment about politics, and I will never want to be a social involved socially. I don't want to give my opinions, but for instance, with this war in Ukraine, I understood that I can't afford not to, because that is part of our reality. And then you change, and then you become wiser or not, you grow up, you get older, you can't have the same writing, you can't have the same interests, because that means that you write the same book all your life, and that's quite boring. I think that the force of a writer comes from his ability to change, his ability to absorb what is happening around him, and then to maybe be a sort of transmitter to the readers, because maybe sometimes young people don't trust their own feelings, but if they trust the writer or they find something interesting in his writing, they read and they answer it. So I think that writers are changeable beings, and even if I don't really believe in this reinventing yourself, but I think that change is part of writing, because the language itself changes, everything changes. So how can a writer during 50 years can be the same? He can't. There is a question there as well.
I thank you. Promise will be quick. So coming back to the point of translation and speaking sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. So coming back to translation and speaking in a different language, do you feel that you lost something in translation, or equally perhaps gained something by being able to express behind the screen almost? So instead of saying I love you or te iubesc, it's all a bit different.
I find that when I speak in Romanian and when I speak in English, I have different degrees of freedom, because English being my, I don't know, third language, I know that people who listen to me, they are okay if I make mistakes. They are okay if not knowing something, I can, put 3 words together and express myself. And I think being forced in life to talk to different audiences, with different backgrounds, with different ways of read you, even because in different languages your work sounds different. I think that helps a writer to become a sort of more inclusive, more bold, I would say, because I don't know if any of you tried that, but language, your maternal language, even if it seems at the first glance that it allows you to do more, but actually is very restrictive, because it puts you in a sort of cultural pattern, first of all, but then you don't know, look at the children, then they don't know how a dragonfly is called in English. They will say it's an insect which flies, which has colorful or transparent. So this is happening with a writer as well in another language. Talking about translations, I've been working now like with 17 translators, and sometimes they are lucky because I don't speak the language, so I can't give them any feedback in Norwegian or Polish or Bulgarian or Swedish, for instance. But unfortunately for the English translator, I do speak some English. And then I found out that I don't translate the book. I have a tendency to rewrite the book, because when I read it in English, it sounds completely the work of another person. That's not my voice, because the voice of an author, it contains a certain, inflections, faults even, that makes the style. But when I heard it in English first time, I said, oh my God, that's completely unbelievable. It doesn't mean. And then my personal way of measuring the translation is then people in other countries come to me with tears in their eyes and said, like, it's such a beautiful book. And then I understand that if people say that it's a good translation, something is not quite good. But if they say it's a beautiful book, it means that they felt it's written in their language, because it means that they didn't think for even for a second that something there doesn't really, it doesn't belong there. And I remember, for instance, for the French translation, there is one friend of mine, she's very active, and she says, like, you don't say this in French, you don't say this in French. And I say, yeah, but I said it in Romanian. And the translator actually found a very good solution, said, yeah, but you don't say that in French, because she said that no French will understand. So the question for a translator is then, what do? Do you translate faithfully? Do you find analogs? Do you find a way to talk to the audience? Because that is a big discussion. In the same time, if a translator will always translate as he wants, just to talk to the audience, what stays from original doesn't remain anything. So I think I'm grateful to all the translators that they loved the book. First of all, they wanted to translate it into their language, because that is the main, that is the first step and the only step it takes. Because it can be a very good book, but if no one wants to translate it, it will never be in that language, So I forgot the question, of course, but you can just.
Okay, so we only have time for one more question from online and one in the room. We've been going on solidly. So do you take inspirations from your readings? It's a question from online.
There are books which I keep on a shelf, and that shelf has, it's like feelings for me, because there are books which I just take and I can open it in any page. Don't ask me what books, I'm not gonna say it, but it's just, I remember reading for the first time the book, and it gave me a sort of state of mind, and then I go back for that feeling. And there are books which I start reading, and then I have a feeling of happiness that I didn't write it because I feel that it's wrong. Everything is wrong, and I'm happy it's not my book. And I think I do get inspiration from literature, because good literature and bad literature are equally important. I'm asked many times, do you recommend to your children what to read? And I rarely do, because I think it's very important for every person to read bad books as well, to have this experience of buying with your last money a very bad book, maybe an acclaimed book, and you go home and you read it and you said, I don't get it, just why people say it's good. It doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't speak to me. It's a bad book. Because that means that you are starting to build your appetite for literature. Only bad books can be a way to decide for yourself what is good literature. Because otherwise, if you follow only recommendations, you will never have this feeling. I always go to libraries and sometimes just go and buy and take a book from a shelf, and I read a couple of pages. And sometimes it's enough to take it home, because something there, even if it's from the middle and it's not related to anything, just tells you that that will be your book. Because you mentioned Aglaia Veterani, that it's an amazing book for me, and it's important because I read it in the summer. I started to write the summer when my mom had green eyes, and I read it, and it blew my mind. You know, I said, I think I changed my style of writing because that book, and that feeling will be nothing will change that feeling of a huge admiration, of a happiness. If she would be alive, I swear I would have bought a ticket, go to Switzerland, find her, just to see her on the street. That's how much I loved that book. And that is amazing, you know, when you can be inspired of a book so much. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. So there was someone here. Yeah. So Maria, do you mind?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Good evening, everyone. My name is Santa Beniamines, and I want to thank you for organizing this event. And I'm really, really happy, Tatiana, to see you again. Paula, good evening, and to all of you. I was just thinking, Tatiana, when you said a bit earlier that literature needs to provoke you and needs to annoy you sometimes. And I remember how annoyed I felt many years ago when I read for the first time The Summer My Mother Had Green Eyes, because shortly after, I mean, it was like 1 year before I lost my mom, and I read your book afterwards, and I really felt annoyed, and it was painful sometimes. But you know, until now, it has been the only book that rejected me, actually, but still I kept it, and I finished it till the end. I couldn't leave it aside. Now, I was thinking, you said a bit earlier also that you really like, let's say, Latin American literature. And because one of my favorite writers is Isabel Allende, and she has some rituals. And I know that lots of writers, they have some rituals when writing their novels. And she's starting all the time to write a novel on the 8th of January, for example. Now, my curiosity is, do you have any, let's say, rituals in writing? I have lots of questions to ask you related to the books, but this will be in other contexts. But really, congratulations for everything. And please, if you have any rituals, just let us know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I think it was half of my luck that when I started writing, I had very small children. So I wrote whatever I had to write when they were letting me do it. So I didn't wait for inspiration. I just sat down. Probably the journalism helped a bit, because when you are in television and you have a news journal coming up, you know that you have a certain deadline in time. So you don't afford to wait for inspiration. Just sit down, do your piece, because if you don't, the train is gone. And I had at that time that discipline of sitting down, saying, I have an hour or I have a half an hour, and I do that. Unfortunately, after the first book, I lost that thing, and the writing didn't come so easy, because maybe I knew already that is going to be published. I stopped many times thinking that people will read this, how they will read it. I found myself in difficulty because I knew that I have an audience already, and that is not necessarily a good thing for a writer. In the moment you write for someone, already, you are not your true. Yes. So the first book, I wrote it fast. The second one, not so fast. But between the second and the third novel, I had a gap of 7 years. And it was hell. I had to stop many times just because I felt that my voice is forced, because I want to finish it, and I want to finish it in a certain way, and I want it to be as good as the first one or maybe as the second one. And only then I said, okay, I will never finish it. I will just drop it. And then I found that peace of mind. This is when I finished it, because it's difficult for a writer to keep in mind that he's a writer. The best things come when you are sort of unconscious, and then you just don't perform. Yeah, so the answer is that I don't really have rituals. I just have to just find time, sit down and be honest and happy. Yeah, if I can be happy as well.
Do you still want to take a couple of questions, or it's been a long day? Oh, okay. So I think Adina, you were next. Adina, you wanted to ask something. Sorry.
Thank you. It was more a comment, and it's going back to translations. I wrote something in French, and then I translated it into English. The French version had 12,000 words. The English lost 5,000 words. What I'm trying to say here is that the discussion about translations are many, but there is very interesting how the syntax and how the vocabulary and how the way we express one thing in one language can expand or contract and be exquisitely identical in conveying the message. But I was absolutely, and I know, for instance, that if you translate from Romanian into English, it will shorten, and the other way around, right? But I think there is something to reflect about, about the capability of different languages to express the same thing, but in a way that's concise and uses another. It's just very funny. I was so shocked because I was looking at the length of the thing, and I thought 5,000 words difference between two languages, French and English. Anyway, just an observation by the way of translations.
Who else put their hand up? Yeah.
I have a question. Coming from Moldova, and reading most of the books for your Russian language, would you want to have your books translated into Russian? Would you be able to do your own Russian translations? And what would you feel having your book translated into Russian? Would you be scared, happy, or doubtful?
I mean, coming from Eastern Europe, I think I had to, long time ago, to make a distinction between a language and politics of a country, between a Russian and a communist. I do have friends who are Russians. I have to do that because Russian is part of my, as I said before, part of my past, and Russian literature it still contains some of my favorite writers. So to answer the question is that I think the first book was translated in Russian already, but is not published in Russian. And I think that is showing a bit how I feel about that. I don't want it to be published now. I don't know how we feel, because it's me and the translator who discussed that, and because he feels the same thing now. We just put it on hold. But everyone who is coming from Eastern Europe with the war in Ukraine, I think honestly has to do a bit of reset of feelings towards this language, towards this situation. It's not easy. It's not easy to know that people you admired, the books you admired, the film directors you admired are now speaking in that language for war, for instance. So I think it's something which is deeply. It's a fight for many of us, because speaking that language and being part of us, we still feel somehow guilty. Okay, let's say me. I'm not gonna talk in the name of the others, but I had this discussion with my Russian friends who feel the same. So it's not an easy thing. I think that now I don't want it to be published in Russian, even if it's published by people who are against the war. But I don't think I will burn all my favorite books in Russian either. So I think I said this yesterday. I'm thinking about my favorite writer, for instance, Chekhov, right? I'm thinking that if he would live, he would be on the right side of so that is something which I'm telling myself. Whether it's correct or not, I don't know. It's an interesting topic, and it's an interesting debate. And we had that debate with some of my German friends, writers, who said that they had a similar period after the war, like feeling somehow, I don't know, burdened by German language because it was the German of it was the language of aggressor. So it's not new, this dilemma. It's just to answer that it has been translated, but it hasn't been published.
So we'll take a question from online. Thank you for a wonderful talk, and hello from sunny Slovakia. I first came across Tatiana's book, The Glass Garden, in a bookshop over here, where it is very popular. Why do you think this book in particular has struck a chord with Central European audiences?
Well, the short answer is because Eastern Europeans, they did have similar things in their countries, so we don't have to explain. When we went to Prague, we had a big event. People who came there, they didn't need explanation. We just started immediately with questions about because they lived that. So Eastern European, most of them had the same childhood, like Lastochka in Bulgaria. We had a launch where you see that even buildings are the same, even balconies are the same. So you don't really need to explain. Maybe the brands are different of furniture or of candies, but we do understand. This is the short answer, and I'm very grateful that people from other countries feel that this book tells something of their story as well. Yes.
Anyone else from the room? Maybe the last question for tonight.
There is one there. And yeah.
Radu? Okay, yeah.
Hello, thank you for the panel discussion. It was amazing and one of the highlights of my week. I was
Live, did you say?
Week. Modesty.
I was wondering, since you have mentioned that some of your work does involve writing in a sort of hybrid Romanian Russian language mix, how do some of the hidden meanings of that carry over in translations, and is this something that can ever be understood in translation?
Yes, I think we had this question with some of my translators. Since you mentioned like countries like Slovenia, Slovakia, or Bulgaria, or they do still understand Russian, so they left as in original, but with translation down, because I think it's important to some of those phrases. They come in a certain way, and for people from Moldova, they don't need to be translated. They are somehow integrated, but for other countries, they do have to be translated. I think that this question should be for the readers. For instance, in Germany, how did they found it? Was it difficult? Was it not? I believe that in translation, it's a bit heavier than in original, because original is read by people who do speak both languages mostly. And I don't know. I think that I just had to trust the translators that they did their best job, and it was enough just to explain in the footnote. Yeah, if I understood correctly.
But I think actually your books are mostly read by Romanians rather than Moldovans, just because they are more by number. So
yes.
yeah, and so I think maybe it's an interesting kind of question for the Romanian readers, how they read The Glass Garden, because they don't speak Russian, and maybe that had an effect on your reading.
Okay. I think some of the terms were explained in Romanian.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I was
You have a crossing at the end.
Yeah.
I'm very curious how this book will look like in English.
I was just going to say quickly that as someone from Moldova reading this book, I would obviously understand what it was saying, but I would also check the translation. And for me, honestly, it did lose a bit of its spark to read the translation, just because those like phrases are so context specific and are so like just inherent to us, and it feels so personal and so like intimate, whereas reading it translated did feel more like wishy-washy. Although it didn't change the meaning, in my heart it kind of changed how I related to it, I guess. Yeah, but I'm not Romanian, but obviously we are Romanian, but
And that is another evening about that talk.
Sorry. Yeah. So, one more question, or can we draw? Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I just want to say thank you to everyone, especially to Tatiana and Paula and the lovely girls here. Thank you to our collaborators, the Moldovan Embassy and the Romanian Cultural Institute. Thank you for everyone online. Thank you for everyone here. And let's continue with a glass of wine. Yeah, bye-bye.